sunshine. I realize I am in sunshine. The skies are turning blue. Would you like to go to the top of sunshine?
Hello again, welcome to Accept Truth with Joy. In this part 3 of What is a Species, we're going to be talking a little bit about what does speciation and biological diversity have to do with the flood, and what are some of the conflicts and what are some of the solutions that potentially we can think about here. So first, I think it's important to just again remind ourselves about what is this hypothesis that if you do a literal reading of the Bible, what would that flood look like? And again, remember in the previous video we talked a little bit about creation, but if you follow the timeline that's in the Bible, it would be 2,000 years or so later. I don't have the exact time, but just a few thousand years later, after the end of the creation and Adam and Eve leave the Garden of Eden, you would have people living, and then you would have a moment where the prophet Noah is commanded to build the ark and then get some of his family members, a few people on the ark, and then a bunch of animals, a bunch of organisms. And mostly it talks about 7 or 14 of the clean organisms and 2 of every of the unclean organisms. But it's clearly not all the organisms either. I don't know that they were having aquariums on the ark with fish, and I don't know that they were carrying a ton of dirt to try to keep all of the worms and samples of different kinds of bacteria and all, so clearly the story is not complete in what it's actually trying to say that it did, but mostly it refers to, the larger organisms. So, again, and that's kind of the literal reading. Now, of course, the one way to just deal with this is say, don't take the scriptures literally in this. Think the scriptures were not written to give us a biological, hypothesis for how the biodiversity that's currently on the earth today got here. Okay, same kind of idea with the creation. So that's one way to obviously deal with this, but I think it's important that at least if you're going to be somewhere within this continuum of a literal reading of the scriptures all the way to a really loose reading of the scriptures, potentially even to where this is just a story, a myth, you've got to still deal with the evidence, that which has been demonstrated. We've got to look at and ask questions about. So mostly what I want to do is just ask questions about these things so that you start thinking about this. So first, let's talk about things like gathering. How do you gather all of the organisms? Now, I guess you can invoke some divine intervention that's pushing all the organisms essentially on the ark in some way. But still, how did you get organisms that were from Australia or from, way far away from wherever the ark was being built? How did you get them there? What about organisms as they're traveling? They've got to be eating. Were they finding the food? I mean, some organisms only can eat certain kinds of things. Like koalas can only eat certain kinds of, eucalyptus. And if they had to travel all the way from an area where eucalyptus didn't grow, how did they survive that trip? And then, you have to deal with the entire, just how many numbers. Like, what were the numbers of organisms that were on the ark? And this is where it has to do with this idea of species that we've referred to in the video 1. There are lots of species on this planet. And what did it mean when it said of every kind? Did kind equal species, or did kind equal genus, or did kind equal family? We don't know. And so I think it's important to think about those kinds of things. How did all of the organisms fit on board of this ark? The ark was not, infinitely large. So how did you fit everything? How did you fit everything and all the food to provide food for everything for a year, right? How did you take care of their waste for a year? And then again, you've only got like 8 people on the ark, so are there 8 zookeepers that are doing this? And of course, because I study mayflies, I got to think about mayflies. Mayflies are called ephemeroptera because they are the short-lived winged insects. And that's because they only survive as adults for anywhere from hours to days to maybe a couple weeks at most. But they have incomplete digestive tracts. They don't eat food as adults. The only thing that they're supposed to do as adults is find a mate, right, reproduce, and then they die. And they can live, though, for much longer, their entire life, as the immature form that's living inside the river. But mayflies only survive inside of kind of clean water moving streams. There's some that can be in kind of more lentic waters, but mostly they're in kind of, fast moving streams. Well, there's no freshwater streams on the ark. So how would you keep alive the mayflies that you need to keep alive? And they don't survive as adults for longer than again, just a short period of time. So how would you, all mayflies would have died during the flood, right? That just wouldn't have, because you've got too much water. Is it salt water? Is it fresh water? I don't know. I just start thinking about all the complications if you try to do a literal reading, and it becomes very difficult, of course. Okay, but let's assume that somehow all of these miracles did take place and you actually got an ark that had a representative biodiversity of the major kinds of organisms. But then when the ark stops, when the flood stops and the rains stop, and you go back to the world in which it looks like right now, right? Where all the continents are right now, where all of the main geological forms have been formed as it is right now, and you start going across the earth, how do you produce the biodiversity that exists? Remember I said more than 2 million species have been described for things alive right now. And there's at least another 10 million species to describe. And that's just like big stuff too. I'm not even talking about single-celled organisms and protists and all of these other things. There are so many things out there. So how do you produce all of that biodiversity from just whatever made it on the ark or what could have survived in the water, in the floodwaters, right? And we haven't even started to discuss plants. How did plants survive this, right? And then we can go around right now and we can go and sample the genetic diversity of all of these organisms. There's no way that in just, a few thousand years, you could have produced the amount of genetic diversity that exists from just, a male and female from each kind. No, that's not how evolution works. That's not. Now, again, you could invoke some divine intervention that's speeding up the mutational process or something. I don't know. I don't even know how that would happen. But it's just, as soon as you start to take this idea seriously, it seems like you either have to say, well, I have to invoke intervention after intervention after intervention after intervention to account for all of the patterns that we see today. You'd have to somehow explain it with all of that, magic wand exercising, or you have to say there's a problem here, right? And how do we deal with this? Maybe we need to relax our assumptions about what that was. You need to think about, how do you get all those species back to where they currently exist now? So how did the marsupials get back to Australia? How do things that are flightless birds, right? How did they get back to islands that are in the middle of the ocean? Right? How did all of this happen? So again, these are just a lot of questions. I think that my take home with the flood is, obviously it wasn't a worldwide flood. If I'm wrong, I guess I'm wrong, but it seems like that this is a story, first of all, that we shouldn't be taking notes from the special creation, young earth creationists on this. There's no reason that Mormons need to go down that road. But I think trying to do a literal interpretation here is really problematic. And I hope I've provided enough questions that you could think about, what are the problems that you have to kind of consider. I will post in the description of this video some links to some really good articles that go even more in depth about not only the biodiversity and the flood, but also like geology and some of the other things that you can think about with the worldwide flood. So I'll add those links into the description. Hope you like this quick video on what is a species and what does it have to do with the flood.
Sunshine with me. The doors are open, the skies are too. Sunshine is coming in for me and you. Sunshine.